most powerful man in the world could not let his dead wife go. Instead of mourning her, he searched for a face that matched hers. He found it. On a teenage boy, he mutilated him, dressed him in her robes, and married him before the Roman Empire. Except, this isn't mythology, it happened. One of the most disturbing true stories ever buried by history, where obsession, power, and grief collided to destroy a young life and stain an empire in silence. This is the story of Sporus, Nero's living ghost. Rome, 67 AD, was swelled with gold, decadence, and blood. Chariots thundered past marble columns. Slaves hurried to market with figs and salted meats. Senators in white togas whispered behind closed doors. But none of that mattered today. In the forum, the empire's beating heart, the crowd parted. Nero was walking, flanked by guards and advisors, and a new bride. She was young, ethereal. Silks laced with emeralds draped her small frame, soft brown eyes, perfectly rouged cheeks. Except, that wasn't what silenced the crowd. It was the whispers, not of admiration, but of fear. Because they know, everyone does. That woman by Nero's side, she's not a woman at all. She's Sporus. Once a boy, now paraded as the empress of Rome. And what Nero did to him wasn't just cruel. It was calculated, deliberate, and disturbingly public. To understand how this horror began, we go back, not to Sporus, but to Poppaea Sabina, the woman Nero destroyed, before he rebuilt her in another body. In the early days, Nero's reign seemed hopeful. He was only 16 when he took the throne. He cut taxes, opened public bathhouses, wrote poetry. The people called him charming, the Senate called him tolerable. Rome exhaled. But power doesn't just corrupt, it distorts, it isolates, it warps judgment. And when there are no limits, no consequences, even a single moment of rage can reshape history. Nero had married Octavia, daughter of Emperor Claudius, cold, political, public. But Nero didn't want cold, he wanted fire, and fire came as Poppaea, stunning, sophisticated, unafraid to challenge him. Where Octavia was dutiful, Poppaea was magnetic and manipulative. She didn't flirt, she commanded. Soon Nero cast Octavia aside, married Poppaea. He gave her titles, riches, power. He gave her Rome. But love twisted into obsession. Nero followed her like a shadow, guards outside her chambers, sculptors ordered to carve her likeness in marble, bronze, ivory, dozens of copies, scattered through his villas. At night, he watched her sleep. When she spoke to other men, he grew violent. When she disagreed, he shouted. Poppaea was not like the courtiers who bowed and smiled. She argued, mocked his performances, questioned his decisions. One night, she crossed an invisible line. It was a domestic fight, maybe about his late-night absences, maybe his humiliating stage shows. Poppaea was pregnant, carrying Nero's heir, and she was angry. He lashed out. One blow, maybe two. Some say it was a kick to her stomach, others, a full beating. Within hours, she was dead. Nero, emperor of the known world, slayer of rivals, beloved of gods, fell to his knees, sobbing over her body. He begged her corpse to breathe, ordered her to wake, screamed at his physicians to revive her. They couldn't. Something inside him broke. What followed was grief, twisted into madness. He ordered a state funeral with divine rites, declared Poppaea a goddess, had her embalmed, Roman cremation be damned, built her a tomb more lavish than any in memory. But even that wasn't enough. Because Nero didn't just want to remember Poppaea, he wanted her back. And then, he saw Sporus. Sporus was young, barely a teenager, a palace-born slave, later freed, raised to serve, educated in courtly mannerisms, and he had her eyes. Sources say the resemblance to Poppaea was uncanny. The shape of the jaw, the delicate frame, the lips. One look, and Nero knew. This wasn't grief. This was opportunity. He would rebuild her, not in marble, not in memory, in flesh. Because Nero didn't just dress Sporus in silks and jewelry, didn't just call him by Poppaea's name. He ordered a surgery, castration, not for punishment, not for religion, but to make Sporus more feminine. It was involuntary. He was cut, violated, reassembled, for the pleasure of a grieving god-king who wanted his dead wife back. Painful, yes. Likely life-altering, risk of death, infection, scarring, high. But Nero didn't care. He gave Sporus Poppaea's gowns, her jewels, her perfumes. Soon the boy lived in her old quarters, surrounded by handmaidens and hairdressers. Tutors trained him to walk gracefully, speak softly, move with courtly charm. Every lesson reinforced the lie. You are her now. Then Nero did something no Roman emperor had ever done. He married Sporus, a full imperial wedding in the palace. Lavish, official, public. Guests watched, trembling behind masks of protocol. Sporus, dressed as Poppaea, walked down the aisle. Nero gave vows, kissed him, declared him empress, and Rome, stunned, appalled, helpless, applauded. The people whispered, some in horror, some in fascination, but no one dared defy him. At every public event, Sporus stood at Nero's side, quiet, graceful, empty-eyed, the perfect doll, the dead wife reborn. But inside, we don't know. History didn't record his words, only his masters. And yet, the story doesn't end here. Nero's empire would soon unravel, rebellion would rise, the Praetorian Guard would turn, death would come knocking on the emperor's door, and when it did, Sporus was still there, at Nero's side, a living ghost, a stolen identity, a boy trapped in a woman's body, forced to wear the mask of a dead empress. But in the ashes of the empire, that mask became a target, and what happened to Sporus after Nero's fall was even more grotesque, more humiliating, and more revealing than anything before. When the imperial blade turned against Nero, it wasn't with ceremony, it wasn't with dignity. He didn't go out like Caesar, stabbed in the Senate, remembered as a martyr of ambition. No, Nero died alone, hunted, hiding in a villa, outside Rome, like a rat chased from his own palace. He clutched a dagger in trembling hands. Beside him, his last loyalists whispered of suicide, the noble Roman's exit, but he couldn't do it. The man who had burned half the city, murdered his own mother, turned a child into a wife, couldn't find the courage to end his own life, so he asked someone else to do it. They helped. The blade struck. The last of the Tulio-Claudian emperors collapsed in his own blood. But what happened next was worse. Nero's death didn't free Sporus. It exposed him. In the power vacuum that followed, he became dangerous, not just a memory of Nero's madness, but a symbol of it. He was valuable, recognizable, and above all, deeply vulnerable. He still wore the jewels of an empress, still answered to a name that wasn't his. And in a crumbling empire desperate to erase Nero's shame, he became the ultimate bargaining chip. Nymphidius Sabinus claimed him first, a commander in the Praetorian Guard, one of the men who helped bring Nero down. Sabinus needed legitimacy. He wasn't noble-born, but he could claim something almost as powerful. Nero's widow. He paraded Sporus through the streets, treated him like imperial property, forced him to dress in ceremonial gowns, smile for the crowds. But Sabinus overplayed his hand. When he declared himself emperor without the Senate's approval, his own soldiers murdered him. Sporus passed to the next man, Otho, an old companion of Nero's, now a rival claimant to the throne. He took Sporus into his household, treated him as a prize, a reminder of the man he'd once served, and perhaps a trophy of victory over him. But Otho didn't last. In a bid to end civil war, he killed himself. Just months after taking power, Sporus moved again. Then came Vitellius, perhaps the cruelest of them all. Vitellius didn't see Sporus as a partner, or a relic, or a bride. He saw him as entertainment. Sporus was brought to court in chains of gold, made to perform at banquets for laughing senators. They toasted Nero's death, while ogling the ghost he left behind. They called him Sabina, asked him to reenact wedding scenes, clapped when he bowed and blew kisses. But that wasn't enough for Vitellius. He had one more idea. A public spectacle, in the Colosseum, a grotesque performance of a mythological wedding, one where Sporus, dressed in bridal robes, would be violated and killed before thousands, not metaphorically. Literally, Rome's appetite for cruelty had always been bottomless. Gladiators, executions, beast hunts. But this was theatre soaked in humiliation. When Sporus heard the plan, he didn't wait, he didn't run, he didn't plead. He made one final decision, the only one that had truly belonged to him in years. He took his own life. Some say it was poison, others say he slit his wrists in a marble bathhouse. No one knows for certain, but one thing is clear: he died before they could turn him into a spectacle one last time. He was maybe 20 years old. Pause for a moment. Think about that. He was a slave, then a bride, then a living ghost, then a political token, then a planned execution, and through all of it, he never chose any of it. His only real act of agency was his death, and even that was framed by Roman historians as an afterthought, a final twist in Nero's bizarre legacy. But it was so much more than that. It was resistance. It was refusal. It was Sporus saying, "I will not be your puppet anymore." Still, Rome didn't mourn him. There were no monuments, no tombs, no mourning rituals, because you don't mourn dolls, you throw them away when they stop performing. But we're not done. What makes Sporus's story so terrifying and so important isn't just the personal tragedy, it's what it reveals about power, identity, control, and how, even today, the echoes of his suffering still ripple through history's darkest chambers. After Sporus took his own life, Rome moved on. The empire surged forward in chaos. 4 emperors died in a single year, wars broke out in the provinces, the Colosseum filled again, and Sporus, he became a punchline, a whisper, a warning. Ancient Roman writers didn't honor his death. They mocked it. They called him Nero's sickest indulgence, that boy bride, the ultimate symbol of excess. They didn't see a person. They saw a spectacle, a reflection of Nero's madness, not a victim of it. And yet, Sporus never disappeared completely. His story was too grotesque, too strange, too unforgettable to vanish entirely. In historical texts, he keeps appearing, not as a man with a mind or soul, but as a cautionary tale. Writers used him to say, "Look how far an emperor can fall," but they never asked what did it feel like to be Sporus. And that's where the real horror begins, because what Rome did to Sporus wasn't just physical, it was psychological warfare on a level few have ever endured. He wasn't just mutilated, he was reprogrammed, taught to erase himself, his name, his body, his voice, his past, shaped into a ghost wearing someone else's face. Every piece of his identity overwritten, and the worst part, he had to smile while it happened. Sporus was meant to be grateful, silk and gold, baths and banquets, attention, privilege, all poisoned, because none of it was his. It was Poppaea's, it was Nero's, a tomb dressed like a palace, and inside it, Sporus disappeared. For nearly 2,000 years, he stayed frozen in that role, a footnote in Nero's biography, not a person, a character in someone else's tragedy. But in recent decades, something shifted. Historians, archaeologists, gender theorists, they started looking again, not at Nero, but at Sporus. And what they found wasn't just pain, it was resilience. Think about it. How did he survive for years in the belly of one of the most dangerous courts in history? How did he outlive Nero, Sabinus, Otho, Vitellius, all of them? How did he keep playing roles, knowing who he really was had been taken? That's more than survival. That's defiance. Some scholars now believe Sporus was far more intelligent, politically savvy, and emotionally adaptive than ancient sources admit. He didn't just endure the performance, he mastered it. He used Nero's delusion to stay alive, stayed close to power, not only because he was forced to, but because in the chaos of Rome, proximity to the throne was sometimes the only shield from death, and when that shield finally failed, he chose his own exit, not theirs, his. This forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How many stories like Sporus's have we lost? How many human beings were swallowed by empire, repurposed into playthings or propaganda? How many minor characters in history were actually survivors of unimaginable violence? And how do we tell their stories, not as curiosities, but as people? Because Sporus was not a freak, he wasn't a symbol, he wasn't a joke. He was a child caught in a monster's grief. And when we peel back the layers, the cruelty, the forced femininity, the political theater, we find someone whose suffering should haunt us, not as a scandal, but as a mirror. Because the truth is, empires have always found ways to erase the inconvenient, to silence those who don't fit, to turn bodies into symbols, and to call it history. That's why Sporus matters now more than ever. His story isn't just about Nero, it's about us, about what we choose to remember, and what we allow ourselves to forget. We often talk about empires in terms of battles, conquests, gold, monuments carved in stone, but beneath every empire is a body, and sometimes That body never got to choose what it became. Sporus was one of those bodies. A boy who never asked for power, never plotted to seduce an emperor, never sought to wear a crown. He was a child, born into slavery, shaped by Rome's machinery, finally claimed by a man who couldn't tell the difference between love and possession. For all Nero's wealth, his armies, his art, his gods, there was still one thing he couldn't control: death. When he lost Poppaea, he couldn't bring her back, so he built a copy, not from marble, not from memory, from flesh. Sporus became the emperor's delusion, living, breathing, suffering proof that Nero's grief could become law. But Sporus was never Poppaea, and Nero knew it. Which is why he dressed him, taught him, cut him, married him, because Sporus as he was, wasn't enough. He had to be destroyed and rebuilt, not loved, owned. We tell stories about men like Nero to understand how absolute power corrupts, but we tell stories about people like Sporus to remember what gets lost in the shadows. His life is the negative space of history, the shape made by absence, the absence of choice, the absence of safety, the absence of identity, and yet, for years he survived, wearing someone else's face, playing someone else's role, trapped in someone else's grief. But his final act, his suicide, wasn't surrender, it was refusal, a quiet, devastating declaration that he would no longer be a mirror for someone else's madness. Not for Nero, not for Vitellius, not for the bloodthirsty crowds of Rome. It was the only decision truly his, and that makes it sacred. You won't find Sporus's tomb. There are no grand inscriptions, no statues, no cults in his name, only fragments, footnotes, flashes of horror in scrolls written by men who never knew his voice. But we can choose to remember differently. We can choose to see him, not as an ornament, or an anecdote, but as a soul, because the true legacy of empire is not just in what it builds, but in what it breaks. And Sporus, he was broken, by power, by grief, by history itself. But in the end, he still made a choice, and that's more than Nero ever did. If stories like this leave you haunted, if you believe history should remember, not just the emperors, but the ones they used and erased, subscribe to Shrouded History. We uncover the past the monuments try to hide, not just what they built, but what they buried. Until next time, stay curious, and stay unafraid to look where history flinches.